Hi, everyone. My name is Christian Mallard. I'm the head of marketing and sales with Enerdata. Welcome to this webinar. Please meet our speakers today, namely Aurélien, who is a project manager of our EnerFuture platform, and Jacques, who's our senior modeling expert. So the webinar will last about an hour today, including Q&A. So rest assured you will be receiving the presentation by email at the end of the webinar. And over the course of the webinar, please feel free to ask any question that you may have in the Q&A chat box in Zoom, all right? So hopefully everyone will be able to join, because I was told there was a Zoom update this morning. So hopefully everything went smoothly. And yeah, we can start. The next slide, please. Thank you. So a few words about Enerdata. Enerdata, we're a spin-off of a research center. We've been around for more than 30 years now, and for now we're about 70 people, based mostly in Grenoble, in the French Alps, and also with an office in Singapore. We are specializing in the analysis and modeling of energy and climate issues, as well as new technologies, clean technologies. I mean, our clients are mostly government bodies, for which we help shape up the energy climate policies, and corporates, for energy climate scenarios and ROI calculations and stuff like that. And in terms of partners, we have global networks all across the globe to address all these issues and conducting some research. Next slide, please. So our expertise lies into the market intelligence, the statistics, and the modeling, of course, and the energy climate issues worldwide, and also at country level and at sector level. We have a very in-depth expertise of especially the demand side at sector level, and also of power generation in terms of capacities, production, and technologies. Next slide, please. Right, so the webinar today is about energy climate scenarios. So as you know, lots of countries have released their 2050 objectives. For some other countries, it's 2060 or even 20.
Hello, everyone. It looks like Christian is frozen, so I will take on from now. So the agenda is first to have a look at the approach of our scenarios. How do we model and prepare the scenarios? And then we'll give a global overview of the EnerFuture scenarios, which is our annual production of energy and climate scenarios. In third, we'll have a focus on the European Union results for 2040, 2050, and give you an insight on the European Union results, and finally conclude quickly on some interesting aspects. So you can see here our pictures. So I'm Jacques Després, Senior Energy Analyst at Enerdata for around 2 years, and previously I was working at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. So I will take care of presenting the European Union focus. And my colleague here.
I'm Aurélien Peffen, and I'm responsible for the EnerFuture product here at Enerdata. I'm also involved in modeling activities along with Jacques, and I've been here for about 7 years now. So yeah, I will mostly present the global overview of scenarios today. Happy to dive in now.
So first, let's give a quick snapshot of the results so that you start with good ideas of where we are heading to. So here is the 2050 snapshot for a scenario which we qualify as well below 2 degrees. And what are the main insights? Well, first, in blue, you can see that the efficiency efforts and the sufficiency efforts are crucial because they decrease by 35% the final energy demand globally. versus a business as usual scenario. A big section, a big proportion is due to efficiency, but you can also notice very interesting gains thanks to sufficiency of around 10%. The electrification of the energy system is huge. It grows by a factor of 2.5 between now and 2050. So this is an enormous change in the energy system. You can see that we expect 65% of the car fleet to be electric in 2050, and it's also 40% for trucks. And in buildings, here you see that there is half of the residential heating that is covered by heat pumps. That's a big development. And of course, all of this energy has to be clean if you want to be well below 2-degree climate change by 2050. So this means that the fossil fuel consumption is divided by 4 between now and 2050. And we end up with almost clean electricity and hydrogen production, with 95% CO2-free production of electricity and 90% of the hydrogen being produced by CO2-free electricity as well. Now let's go into a bit of the modeling detail, how it works, to understand better what we are going to present here, because otherwise it makes no sense just giving numbers. What is behind? Here, the scenario definition. We are talking about 3 scenarios in EnerFuture product. So you can see the 3 columns. There is the Ener-based, Ener-blue, and Ener-green. And they are quite contrasted. We are exploring here different pathways for the future. We are not predicting anything. We are exploring pathways depending on several ways of defining the assumptions. So for Ener-based, we are continuing the existing policies and trends what exists today. And we associate this scenario with a temperature increase of around 3 degrees or more. For the Ener-blue scenario, we take into account all the nationally determined contributions and we prolong them to 2050 to end up with a temperature increase around 2.5 degrees. And for Ener-green, finally, so this is the one I was talking right before, we are aiming at a well below 2-degree scenario. So this is a more normative approach where we fix an objective of carbon budget. And we see in the modeling exercise, we build a scenario that gets there. So this is much more ambitious and it's coherent with the Paris Agreement. EnerFuture is relying on the model that we use and develop here at Enerdata, which is called POLE, for prospective outlook on long-term energy systems. Without a model, we would just be producing random numbers, but here we are trying to produce a consistent pathway, a consistent scenario where everything works together, considering energy, economy, environment, and ensuring that we have a global coverage with markets for all energy commodities and exchange between countries and price dynamics between supply and demand. Now, the POLE model in a bit more in detail if you want to have a quick look, but we can talk further about the modeling behind if you need to. So it's owned and maintained and operated by Enerdata already for a number of years. It's a recursive simulation model. So we are starting today and progressively building the scenario year after year. And looking at 66 regions for a world coverage. So all the main G20 countries and every European member states and most countries that have very high significance for the energy world and where we can get data are represented in POLE. And then we have some regions that aggregate the rest. And we have an annual time step until 2050 to describe the dynamics as best as we can. You can see that the inputs are mostly macroeconomic assumptions and also policies, technologies, and resource data. And then the model computes all the energy balances for oil, gas, coal, biomass, renewables. And it has a very fine description of the energy demand sectors and also of the production technologies. Transformation of energy is also a very well-detailed sector for hydrogen, for electricity, and for heat, etc. And now the outputs is what we will present today. So we have energy prices, but also a detail of the consumption, production, investments, and of course, CO2 emissions. So this is just a quick overview of how we build a scenario. We start from today and we add key drivers to define where we are going to, like macroeconomic assumptions, population, GDP, value added by sector. And we add up on top of these policies to define better what every country is going to implement and how they see the future. And little by little, we get to a different pathway. We have a number of nationally determined contributions included in the policy database that we use. Here are just a few examples. I will not read all of them, but the idea is that we try to represent as best as we can what exists, what is declared, what are the intentions of the countries. And now, well, this green scenario I was talking at the beginning is represented here by a green line in terms of CO2 emissions. On the left graph, you see how it compares with the IPCC first to ninth decile range. So it's on the left side, it's for the 2-degree scenarios, and on the right side for the 1.5 degree. So we are a bit in the middle. We are clearly below the 2-degree pathway, but we are slightly above the 1.5 pathway at the beginning of the scenario. The gray area is what the IPCC gathered from several models, including polls actually from other exercise. But all this model ensemble is describing one given scenario for a temperature objective. Our approach is a bit different since we try to represent as best as we can the reality, try to represent the policies in place. So it gives us a slightly higher green line at the beginning, up to 2030, and then we managed to go stronger and get closer to the 1.5 trajectory. So we can confidently describe Green as a well below 2-degree scenario, as you can see here. The logic of definition of this scenario is this, that we have to share the efforts between countries, between sectors, and we do this with a capacity responsibility indicator, meaning that a country with a high GDP per capita and high emissions per capita will have a very strong effort to decrease its emissions. On the opposite, a country with a lower emissions or GDP will make efforts, but a bit slower, a bit more delayed in time, so that we try we try for a just transition. Now, the global overview, I will leave the floor to Aurélien to give us an overlook.
Thank you, Jacques, for the introduction. So now that you've got a better idea of the definition of the scenarios and what is included in these and how we build this using the model, let's have a look at the main results of the scenarios. So as you can see here on this slide, the primary energy consumption, so the total energy demand in the different scenarios, is quite contrasted. You can see in the Enerdata scenario, which is just used as a reference point, the energy consumption is increasing in line with the historical trends. And then we can see that the currently stated policies and objectives enable to curb the energy demand and having it become relatively stable by 2030 and beyond. But to get to a 1.5 degree or well below 2 degree compatible scenario in Green, we have to have the demand decrease after 2030 and then stabilize to a lower level by 2050, basically. So the contrast in energy demand is also matched with the contrast in the fuels that enable to supply this energy. And we can see in the middle graph that the share of fossil fuels in the energy mix is definitely very different in the different scenario. So already in the reference one, in the Enerdata scenario, we can see the share of fossil is slightly decreasing, but the decrease is definitely higher in Blue, where we reach below 50% share of fossil fuel in the energy mix, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. And in the green scenario, well, the drop in the share of fossil fuel has to be quick to reach our climate objectives, basically. So if we add up these two effects on energy demand and fossil fuels, we end up with the CO2 emissions being very contrasted, as you can see on the top right graph, with the blue scenario enabling to curb already significantly CO2 emissions by 2050, 2030, and 2050. But there is still a gap to reach well below 2-degree compatible trajectory that we can see on the green line there. Okay, so that's for the very general overview. Now let's look at the primary energy mixes in the three scenarios. So that's basically out of the total energy consumed, what is the share of the different energy carriers in that mix. I already described the share of fossil fuels. If we want the precise figures, we can see in Enerbase already, I mean, 2/3 of energy is still supplied by fossil fuels by 2050, and this drops to 40%, 39% in Ener-Blue, and only 21% in Ener-Green by 2050. And we can see that the role of renewables here in light green and dark green for biomass as well is definitely increasing in share, but also in absolute terms significantly by 2050, and quicker, obviously, if the climate ambition of the scenario is higher. Also, please keep in mind that here we are looking at the primary energy, and therefore the efficiencies considered for the different fuels are not the same. So even if we look at a relatively small bar for other renewables, it actually translates into a large amount of energy supplied to final demand sectors. Okay. I was talking about final demand. Well, let's have a look at that. The question here is how much should we transform the way we consume energy, and to what extent, depending on our climate ambition. We can see here on the top graph that the amount of energy consumed per capita is increasing slightly if we keep historical trends, I mean, in the Enerdata scenario to 1.4 ton of oil equivalent per capita. But then current policies and pledges allow to envision a decrease of the amounts of energy consumed per capita in global average. Obviously, we are talking about the global average here, to 1.1 ton of oil equivalent per capita. This is compared to 1.3 tons of oil per capita today. And in the Ener-Green scenario, the decrease in energy demand is even higher, and going to 0.9 ton of oil equivalent per capita in global average. So how do we end up having a smaller energy demand per capita? There are two effects. The first one is energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is definitely a key driver that enables to decrease the energy demand. And as Jack showed on the snapshot slide on for the Ener-Green scenarios, it enables to decrease demand by up to 35%, depending on the ambition of the scenario. So Ener-Green 35%. Now, there is also a role to play for sufficiency and behavioral changes, especially in advanced economies, where the way we consume energy and we organize society and the energy systems is definitely key, and some gains can be done there, up to 10% as well in the Ener-Green scenario, as Jacques showed on the slide. Another important part issue that happens in the final demand sector is electrification. That was also mentioned by Jacques, but we cannot understate this at all. So from today's 21% share of electricity in the total final demand, it can grow up to 53% in the Ener-Green scenario, as shown on the bottom graph. This is, due to a lot of things. We have heat pumps, the role of heat pumps increasing a lot in the final demand for space heating in the building sector, but also for low temperature uses in industry. Obviously, electric vehicles will play a large role in the transport sector, both for passenger cars, where it will become the major technology, but also to a certain extent for trucks, especially for light freight vehicles and buses. And then for high temperature industrial processes where, you know, the heat pumps cannot supply the heat needed, there are some technologies that can provide, you know, the enough heat for these processes, such as electric arc furnaces, etc. So the number of end users that will be electrified by 2050 is definitely high, and it spans across all sectors. Now, we are talking about electrification, but it doesn't make any sense to electrify all end users if the supply of electricity is not carbon-free. So here we are looking at the energy supply. On the left side, we can focus on electricity generation. And I think it's no surprise to anyone, but the supply of electricity is going to get decarbonized quite heavily in the future. Even in a baseline scenario, we can see that the share of renewables in the electricity generation goes up from 30% to 50% by 2050. And it's much higher even with the current stated policies and pledges. They allow to envision over 70% of renewables in the power mix by 2050. And this can go even faster and even higher in the Green scenario if we are to reach a well below 2-degree world, up to 80% renewables. So on the right side, you can also see the role of hydrogen. So hydrogen is an energy carrier that will allow to decarbonize some sectors and some end users, and notably end users that are hard to electrify and hard to abate. This includes international transport, in the form of either hydrogen or some fuels based on hydrogen, such as ammonia or methanol. It can also help to decarbonize the heavy freight transports, heavy trucks, long distance, etc. Can be decarbonized using green hydrogen, and also some industrial processes. To name just a few, the use of hydrogen-based DRI for steel industry is definitely one good-looking prospect if we are to decarbonize the industry. Where does this all lead us in terms of emissions? Well, if we are looking at the Blue and Green scenario, as we showed previously, the emissions are going down quite rapidly in the scenarios, but the situation is not necessarily the same in all countries. If we are looking at the graph here, in dark gray, you can see the historical points for GHG emissions per capita in different regions of the world. In light gray, we can see the 2050 point for Base, and then in blue and green, the 2050 points for Blue and Green. There are significant historical discrepancies in terms of emissions per capita. Those are explained by two main factors. The first one is the development level of the country. Generally, the higher the development level of a country, the higher the emissions per capita is. And the second one is the share of fossil fuels in the historical mix. And we can see that in the Blue and Green scenarios, these high differences, historical differences, are tending to be progressively lowered, and that the emissions per capita are progressively converging to the same level, and the differences are smaller. So we can see also that OECD countries end up with having slightly lower emissions per capita than non-OECD countries, where that is definitely logical if we are thinking about effort sharing, right? The OECD countries have more, financial means to decarbonize their economies, and therefore we expect more from them. Okay. This slide shows the decarbonization in different sectors. So on the left graph, we can see the evolution from the Base scenario, the reference scenario, and the stated policy scenario, the Blue scenarios. We can see that the share of the different sector in cumulated emission reductions between these two scenarios And the first thing that comes to mind is that the power sector in yellow there is the main contributor to energy, to emission reduction, sorry. The energy sector as a whole is responsible for half of the emission reductions if we sum up the yellow and light orange bar. Now, the role of other sectors is not to be underestimated as well. Transport and industry have a role to play. And if we transition from the left graph to the right graph, which shows the difference between Blue, so the stated policy scenario, and Green, or 2-degree scenario, we can see that the role of transport and industry relatively is getting higher as decarbonization is going further, right? So it's important to note that obviously the energy sector is a large provider of emission reductions, but all sectors have to contribute, and especially transport and industry with a large role to play by 2050. Now, if we are looking at the effort sharing between countries, here we are looking at the mitigation that is achieved, that should be achieved if countries are to follow their commitments. So if we take the commitments from countries as granted, then compared to reference scenario, we have this level of emissions that is reduced on the graph. And what we can show is that by 2030, most of the reductions are done in the OECD countries. But then if we're looking at the picture for 2050, we can see that non-OECD countries start to have a very large share of the emission reductions. And that's definitely a statement. So accumulated over from today to 2050, OECD countries contribute to 40%, while non-OECD countries account for 60% of total emission mitigated through current commitments and policies only. To give an example, China accounts for a third, basically, of the announced emission reductions by 2050. However, let's keep in mind, and that was what we could see from the bar charts, looking at the emissions per capita by different countries. China end up still with one of the largest emissions per capita, at least among large countries. But I mean, the role of all countries is definitely key here. Now, what is the ambition gap? So what do we miss compared to the stated ambitions and commitments from countries to go to a 2-degree scenario, to below 2-degree scenario? That's what we show here on this graph. And here we can see that the difference between OECD and non-OECD is even higher. We expect, we wouldn't require OECD countries to be responsible for 20% of additional emission reduction on top of existing commitments by 2050, and non-OECD countries by 80%. So don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that we are saying non-OECD countries have to finance all of this transition by themselves. It means that the place where emissions have to be reduced has to be heavily in non-OECD countries, because that's where the easiest emission reductions are located, and that's where the action has to take place. Sorry. Yet this begs the question of who is going to finance and how we are going to finance this transition, obviously. So this relates to the questions of global climate finance. How can we make sure that investments are located in the correct areas and countries, and how do we make sure that the framework for clean investments is correct and is placed in the right locations?
Thank you. Thank you, Aurélien. Well, that's impressive. Now we'll have a deeper look into the European case and what's next for Europe.
Sorry, Jacques. Just one note, we have a couple of questions already, but please, over the course of this presentation, everyone, please feel free to ask your question in the Q&A chat box, okay? Thanks very much. Go ahead, Jacques.
So the question we are trying to contribute here is what's next on the agenda for EU policymakers. Now, it's very hot debate. What are going to be the 2040 objectives for the European Commission and European Union? And let's try to give some insights here. So first, we have to keep in mind that there is a real change in the energy picture in Europe since a few years. Everything's turned around. We have had a lot of increased ambition of the European Union with the Fit for 55, with the RePower EU plan, etc. And the ambition is due to adverse events, and the response is corresponding to the COVID pandemic and also the Russia-Ukraine crisis and gas and energy crisis that was created. And those had large impacts. You can see here that the projections of our scenarios between the 2019 edition and this year's edition is a decrease of about 60% of the coal use in EU 27 in 2050. So this is a big change. Also for oil, 65% reduction, and for gas, 80% reduction in 2050. So the announced policies in the Ener blue have decreased a lot the need for fossil fuels in the future, thanks to the increased ambition of Europe. Now, this ambition is not yet very well defined for 2040. So we know that there is an objective of minus 55% by 2030 and also net zero targets by 2050. What about the intermediary steps? So we have lots of policies and objectives for 2030 at the national level, European level, and also at the 2050 target at national levels. We have several countries having pledged to have carbon neutrality, and also the European Union. For 2040, we have a key milestone here, and the contribution to climate change is going to be dependent on this objective, because you can see here the range of uncertainty is going to define a different carbon budget, a different amount of CO2 emitted in the atmosphere in the duration of the transition. And if we go for the higher range, we will be the European Union will contribute much more to climate change. So this is going to be a main focus of the impact assessment of the European Commission in the following months. The transformation by 2040 that we envisage is huge. Let's say it. In Energreen, so the below 2-degree scenario, CO2 emissions from energy systems and industrial processes decreased by 90% between 2005 and 2040. So you can see here the blue curve is the CO2 per capita for European Union, and the yellow curve is for the rest of the world. So we have a front runner here in Europe, because the region starts from the higher level and needs to set the example, and the revenues are also higher, so the effort is higher compared to other countries. So it is also interesting to see that energy is quite cheap to decarbonize compared to agriculture, for example. So it is one of the priorities here for decarbonization in Europe. Agriculture comes also, but in the second step. On the right side, you can see a graph of the primary energy consumption, and also the line is the CO2 emissions associated. So we can take from this graph that there is about 2/3 of the reductions that is going to happen in the next 2 decades, according to our scenario. So there is very sharp reduction in primary energy consumption in total, and even sharper drop in fossil fuels. Renewable electricity and biomass are taking over. And this is a huge turnaround of the energy system, which is very ambitious, needs to be so, and a transition that is going to have large consequences. The electrification of the European sector is key. So we have here yellow curves for the electricity share of buildings, transport, and industry on the left graph, and the rest, the blue, is the other fuels. and you can see how it decreases in importance. We end up with 52% of the buildings demand being from electricity, 55% for transport, 60% for industry. So it's quite homogeneous actually. And the other fuels are dropping similarly. We have 45% of heat pumps already in 2040 in the European Union. We have 60% of the cars that are electric in 2050. And also low temperature heat, direct reduced iron, electric arc furnaces for iron and steel. So industrial processes going also to electrify strongly. We then benefit from a double effect. So we have a better efficiency, usually of electric devices, much better efficiency in cars, in processes, in heating, etc. And this efficiency is combined with a decrease in energy needs thanks to efficiency efforts. And in the end, all these electrification efforts only translates to an increase of 25% of the electricity consumption by 2040. So this is not such a huge change compared to today. The power sector has to shift towards low emissions. Of course, we see on the right side that the evolution of solar power and wind power is huge, with an increase of 400% for solar, 200% for wind, and in the same time, gas and coal are dropping. Coal is almost disappearing in the power sector by 2040, minus 90%. Only in some specific areas do we keep small amounts of coal production for electricity. Gas is also dropping by 60%. Let's have a short overview of sufficiency efforts. It's a very interesting topic to discuss and keep discussing and encourage, because behavioral changes have a large and structural impact on energy demand. We can expect about 20% reduction of energy needs in buildings by 2050 between the baseline Enerbase and the Energreen scenario. So this is possible thanks to different behaviors in buildings with the temperature for heating and cooling, the over equipment that can be limited, and also behaviors in transport sector with carpooling, car sharing, active transportation like bikes and walking, and public transport, of course. Other policies can have an impact as well, and will be linked to the behavior of people, like the size of buildings, the evolution of surfaces per person, also the number of cars that are going to be used per person, and the food regimes, the food habits of the population will have an indirect impact on the industry production and also then on emissions. The passenger traffic is also subject to a large potential for reduction of demand. Here we see 38% reduction in 2050 for passenger traffic. So this means that we can limit the energy demand in transport. And it's very important to keep this in mind, because it's not so easy to limit emissions in transport sector, and in the historical emissions, it's been quite stable sector. So here we identify a big lever. This sufficiency effort, and also combined with efficiency, can help us limit our energy demand, especially in peak periods, like in the winter period for the power sector. Also the gas demand can be limited thanks to sufficiency and efficiency. We can then reduce reliance on new technologies like CCS or direct air capture, and the pressure on resources, all resources actually, being minerals, metals, or plastics, etc. So the share of carbon capture and storage is not so huge for the European Union. You can see here about 200 million tons CO2 that would be captured in the Energreen scenario in 2050. So this is relatively reasonable, I think. It mostly concerns the power sector and the industry for specifically process emissions that are hard to abate. I'm thinking about cement, for example. this gives us more freedom today, because if we limit the future needs for carbon capture and sequestration in the future, we have more security also for our development of the energy system. On the right side, you can see where emissions are captured. Industry is about 38% in 2050, and the power sector is the majority, 55%. Of course, there are uncertainties on these technologies, so it's good that the scenario managed to limit the amount of CCS that is needed. We have seen some strong challenges and difficulties in some Norwegian tests of carbon capture and storage in Sleipner and Snøhvit sites. So it's quite difficult to predict the real potential for CCS. Therefore, combined with uncertainties on cost and build-up speed, there is a risk here for the transition. So the more we can limit the risk, the better. And finally, I will give the floor to Aurélien to conclude and wrap up the analysis.
Thank you. So I think, and it's good, there was a question about the cost of scenarios. So that's a perfect transition to this slide. Before leaving you with some final recap of the analysis, let's look at the different costs of the scenarios. So on the left graph, you can see the comparison between the Ener-Blue and Ener-Green scenarios compared to the reference one, which is Ener-Base. As you can see, transitioning to a low carbon economy at the global scale would require to increase the costs in the shorter term. So up to 2030, we would need to have a higher cost globally. But then the cost would tend to decrease and to end up lower than the reference case by 2050. And if we look at the 2015 to 2050 period, we can see that the increase in the costs of scenarios for the transition is only about 5%, both for Ener-Blue and for Ener-Green, 4% only. So although there are some, always some uncertainties on the cost of technologies, etc., we can, we can confidently state that the total cost of the transition is not very high in percentage, and this is without accounting for any environmental costs, of the inaction. If we don't do anything, there will be some costs related to adaptation and all of the issues related to climate change. Now, how can we explain this dynamic, higher cost in the short term and lower cost in the long term? Well, basically, the transition makes us move from an OPEX-driven cost structure to a CAPEX-driven cost structure. Renewables, their characteristics, impose that we invest a lot at the beginning. We have to invest in the renewables, but then the operational costs are low. Compared to fossil-based technologies, where the fuel cost is a high share of the total cost. That's what shows on the right graph. Historically, we have a 60% share of variable OPEX in the cost of the energy systems in 2015. But then, if we look at 2050 in our Ener-Green scenarios, this goes down to only 44%. And the share of CAPEX in fixed OPEX is increasing to almost 55%, basically. So that's what explains the dynamic here. We need to unlock short-term investments in renewables and clean technologies, but after that, it's going to end up paying with the cost of energy systems decreasing below a BAU scenario. This definitely, is to be put into perspective with the needs for frameworks and visibility of the country pledges to create a framework for investors to go beyond their usual time horizon. Right? We don't need to look at the short term only to trigger investments. We have to look at the longer term and the big picture. and then we can invest in the technologies, in the clean technologies, and ensure that the energy transition is done and successful in all countries. I think this brings us to a final recap. This is the slide that Jack already mentioned, but just for you to remember these few key points. Our scenario shows that limiting the energy demand is key and possible, and in Energreen we managed to have 35% less final energy demand compared to a BAU scenario, thanks to 25% efficiency gains and 10% sufficiency gains. Then amongst this remaining final energy, we have a lot of electricity with 2.5 times more electricity in percent compared to today in the final energy mix. We mentioned several technologies that enable to do that, namely electric cars, heat pumps, and others. And then the energy supply has to be decarbonized using clean technologies, which enable to drive the fossil fuel consumption down to be divided by 4 compared to today, with notably an almost carbon-free electricity supply and hydrogen supply. Maybe a word from Christian back to conclude the presentation. Are you back, Christian?
Yes, I am. Thanks a lot, Aurélien. Yes, as you've seen, the pulse model is quite comprehensive and big and complex and quite powerful, actually. And the good news is that we, Enerdata and Aurélien and team, have developed an online platform named EnerFuture, where you can access the detailed scenario and underlying data and play around with some sensitivity analysis. So yeah, it's named EnerFuture, and after this webinar, you'll be receiving a link to to try it out for a limited period of time. That's very insightful. Well, thanks very much, Jacques and Aurélien. I think it's time to handle. Yeah, we still have a little bit of time, a few minutes to handle the questions. So maybe Aurélien can answer some of the questions.
Thank you, Christian. I can take the first question, and then I think with Jacques we are gonna, each one of us is gonna answer different questions. I can take the first question from Mr. Cissé. Thank you for the question. So the question is, how do we distinguish efficiency from sufficiency, and if there are a few examples of policies that can fall into one or the other categories. Basically, efficiency, it's more of a technical way of limiting the energy demands. For instance, when you insulate your building, then you will have a higher energy efficiency of your building, and you're going to consume less energy for the same amount of heating, right? When you are at home, you're going to feel the same heat, but you're going to need less energy to provide it because you insulated your building. Whereas sufficiency is more of a behavioral way of reducing energy consumption, or an organization of the society that enables to reduce the energy needs. I'm going to give a few examples of that. So taking the same example, space heating, for instance, well, you can just decide that you don't need to heat your building up to the same temperature set point as before, but you can reduce that by 1 degree, and you're going to be fine with that. So that's sufficiency. You agree to lower a little bit your comfort because it's actually not necessary. So that's the first.
Yeah, by the way, this is often driven by price. Well, that's what happened last year in Europe anyway.
It can be. And also another example of sufficiency, which is a bit different, would be the organization of the transport infrastructure in the cities, for instance, that allow to switch from a energy consuming mode of transport to a, for instance, cycling or walking, and this enables you to reduce the energy consumption for by shifting the energy service that you really want. And a final example, could be to have a car that is, smaller compared to the car that you had, because you don't need all the space. So you decide to have a smaller car, and therefore you're going to consume less energy, but you will be able to drive your car in any case.
I propose to take a question about cost, the combined question. So there is a question about the share of electricity increasing. Does it also increase the higher price of the price of electricity? And a similar question linked to the hypothesis for learning curves of photovoltaic, wind, batteries, electrolyzers, etc. So in the model, we have indeed an increase of new technologies for producing electricity. By new, I mean wind and solar mostly, but also some other new developments. And we have high prices for these technologies at the beginning of the scenarios. And then with the learning effects, we have this endogenized. So the model decides by itself with some specific parameters how the price of these technologies decreases with time and with the more we use them. So now we've seen a decrease of photovoltaic prices of around 90% in the last decade, and we can expect further decreases of the technology in the following years. Not 90% every 10 years, but there is also still some potential for reducing the cost of the technology and the prices for the end user.
Looks like we're having a little bit of a sound problem. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah, switching.
I was saying, sorry, that increasing the share of electricity does not necessarily increase the bills for the end users, because the technologies that will produce electricity in the future are not the same as today, and they can be less expensive than today. The projections of prices for the end users are not very different depending on the scenario chosen for future years. So this is allowed in our scenario by our modeling of learning curves for the different technologies, and the learning rates are specific by technology so that we can model different trajectories by technology.
All right. So I don't know whether we want to handle some more questions or wrap it up.
Sorry about this small technical issue.
Rob.
Another question. I mean, there are some questions about the transition in developing countries. I can't give all of the details and all of the answers. It's definitely a question, a very difficult question to answer. But how are we going to finance transition, and how are we going to help and support? I mean, how are advanced economies going to support developing countries in their efforts to decarbonize? So I can't answer that, obviously. That's the point of all of these multilateral organizations, development banks, the COPs, etc. All of these efforts have to lead us to somewhere if we are to achieve successful decarbonization. But I can just give maybe a side answer as well. I think supporting the countries in setting a long-term vision and a long-term strategy with precise and documented trajectories for their decarbonization, even if it's conditional to some financing from other parties, is definitely key, because it gives a framework for investors, private investors, banks, etc. And it helps them to know that this is a solid strategy. They know where they are going, and then they find that it's less risky to invest in this framework. So that's my little 2 cents on the issue. Basically.
Yeah, indeed. And we do contribute to that at Enerdata by helping some governments developing their long-term vision. Thinking about Morocco, Tunisia, and lots of them actually. And this links to another question of Africa scenario. I'm jumping on this question. Also, we have Africa represented by several regions in our model, so that we can look at the development of the energy system for those regions and countries. And there was also a question on biomass, and actually this is a big question for the African energy system. There is a lot of traditional biomass being used in many areas. And the assumption is that there is a switch from traditional biomass to modern heating and cooking technologies, mostly cooking. For example, through LPG, or even better, through electrification of cooking the techniques. So this shift is very important for the decarbonization of the energy system of those regions. And we have a specific attention for those sectors as well, so that we try to evaluate the decarbonization of Africa as well.
All right.
Well, I can take a final question, maybe, Christian?
Yes, let's do that. Yeah.
So there's a question about the EU and the share of solar PV and wind as renewable energy sources for electricity production. Basically, in our Green scenario, we foresee a 80% share combined of solar and wind in Europe. And if we add other carbon-free sources such as hydro and nuclear, we end up with almost 97% of CO2-free electricity by 2050 in Europe. So that's excluding, fossil-based CCS, etc.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Aurélien. Thanks very much, Jacques. A very insightful presentation. And well, to the audience, thanks a lot for your attention and questions. Not all questions have been answered, so rest assured you're going to be receiving the answers to the remaining questions by email, along with a presentation, the PowerPoint presentation, and then you can even ask some additional questions if you like. So by tomorrow, you will be receiving this recap email, and by then, please feel free to browse our website to check our latest analysis that we made for various countries, scenario analysis, and also the EnerFuture platform. Thanks very much, everyone, and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Have a good day.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.